Dear students, as you know that this is our new lecture on cultural studies, and this has been titled as Structuralism and Cultural Studies. In this video we will be looking at the contribution of structuralism and as well as those philosophers, those theorizers associated with structuralism, and in what manner structuralism and those thinkers, those theorists play an important role in cultural studies. So this is going to be the lookout for this lecture. We have already discussed structuralism and its contribution and some other aspects of linguistic contribution also in our previous lecture, which has been titled as Linguistics and Cultural Studies. That was in fact a more comprehensive video, a more comprehensive lecture. The lecture today is basically just a small attempt to look at structuralism and its relationship with cultural studies. As you know, that in our previous lecture titled Linguistics and Cultural Studies, we talked about the contribution of structuralist philosophers like Ferdinand de Saussure, Claude Lévi-Strauss and Roland Barthes. So here today we will be talking more briefly about some of the terminologies and some of the concepts of structuralism that has been used in cultural studies. Friends, Ferdinand de Saussure, in his famous book titled A Course in General Linguistics, talked about three important characteristics of language. That was language being arbitrary, language being relational, and language being systemic or systematic. With regard to arbitrariness, Saussure was of the opinion that language as such, and words in particular, and their meaning are actually arbitrary. So this is what we have already discussed in the previous lecture titled Linguistics and Cultural Studies. Dear friends, you know that the meanings we attribute to words are entirely arbitrary. The meanings are prescribed to the words through day-to-day usage and common conventions. The fact of the matter is that the structuralists believe that there is no inherent or natural connection between the word and its meaning. The word has no quality of its own that can suggest its meaning. Of course, the onomatopoeic words can be the exception here. So we know, my dear friends, that meaning, according to the structuralist philosophers, does not reside in the word. Therefore, language cannot be said to stand for or reflect the reality. Language is a system in itself, and it refers only to itself, since all words lead to other words. Hence, the relation between the signifier and the signified is purely arbitrary. Another important characteristic which Ferdinand de Saussure attributed to language was that it is relational, that every word makes sense, every word has meaning because it is different from other words in the organizational chain. Hence, Saussure says that cat only means cat because of its difference from hat. Friends, the third and the last characteristic of language which Saussure highlights in his course in general linguistics is that language is being systemic or systematic. So, language, according to Saussure, constitutes our world and our very existence. We need to analyze how meaning is produced through the acts of language. We need to understand the set of structures in language that enable us to speak and make sense. In short, we need to study the signs, SIGNS. We need to study the signs and the systems associated with the signs. So, my dear friends, with this, let us now move on to some other contribution or some other use of a structuralism in cultural studies. Language, the structuralists believe, constructs the very nature of our perception of reality. Thus, literary or visual or musical texts are structured like language itself and what is called its grammar. You know that in our previous several discussions, time and again we have tried to establish that when we talk about text in cultural studies, it is not simply a book, it's not simply the written thing. Anything can be a text. So, a television soap is also a text, a political leader's speech is also a text. And that's why I was saying that literary, visual, musical texts are structured like language and what is called its grammar. So, my dear friends, structuralism actually seeks the process of meaning production. That is, how the text constructs meaning. Anything that generates meaning through certain forms of representation is a text. So, what is a text? Anything that generates meaning through certain forms of representation is a text. The idea of a text, my dear friends, suggests more than the printed word. This is what I was saying earlier. It includes all forms of communication, be it visual, gestural or gestures, verbal, oral, etc. So, thus, my dear friends, as I said earlier, I repeat it again that the TV soaps, the sport events, the music videos, the speeches of the political leaders, a novel, a drama, and mind it, even our identities are all texts. These texts are constructed in language through a process of relationality and difference. Cultural systems, the structuralists believe, that the language works in pairs, the language works in binaries. Friends, the cultural scientists also believe that the cultural system, or systems rather, work in pairs. The structuralists call this binaries, or what you can say binary opposition. So thus cat and hat are pairs that define each other in terms of their difference. So friends, just like language, which works through a system of relation and differences, similarly, culture also works through a series of relations and oppositions. Roland Barthes is of the view that culture, like language, also works in binaries, also works in relations and oppositions. So the works of Roland Barthes, more specifically the works that were related to mythologies specifically, they provide an impetus for the use of structuralist theories in cultural studies. While studying fashion, for example, in that book, the book on mythology, myth something, the title, I'm forgetting the title right now. So while studying fashion in the said book, Barth analyzes the rhetoric of fashion writing. He says that we have the fashion signifier where meaning is derived from the object, for example, cap, the support, for example, head, and the variants, for example, cap, hat, etc. The fashion signified is the external context of the fashion object, a context shared by a society. For example, woolens equals winter. So when we talk about woolens, you know what we are referring to. So that's the meaning of the advertisement. And let us look advertisement as a text, as we have mentioned earlier. So thus the meaning of the advertisement text is available to us because we understand that caps or hats are to be worn on head. So this is the grammar of clothing, that hats or caps are to be worn on the head. Whereas we understand the larger context in which certain kinds of clothings are needed and worn. Meaning is the combination, this is what the structuralists believe. Meaning is the combination of the grammar of the text and the grammar of the cultural context. So look here how the text and the context is related. And I repeat it once again, that meaning is the combination of the grammar of the text and the grammar of the cultural context. So friends, a cap is worn on the head. This is the grammar of the clothing. Whereas the shoe is worn on the foot. Cotton is worn in summer as opposed to the woolens which are used in winter. So a kind of a grammar is involved here also. So here, my dear friends, you can notice that the binaries are between the items of clothings and between the seasons and the cultural contexts. So thus there is a clear structure. Even in this grammar of clothing, there is a clear structure at work. So, friends, structuralism in cultural studies asks us to look at the rules that govern the formation of meaning through a system of differences and relations between signs and the contexts. Structuralism is best approached as a method of analysis concerned with social and cultural structures, or what you can say, predictable regularities that lie outside of any given person. So, as such, structuralism is anti humanist in its decentering of human agents. In our previous lecture, also, we referred to the lecture that was titled as Linguistics and Cultural Studies. We talked about the kind of criticism that was faced by Saussure and even Roland Barthes with regard to their structuralist concepts. So, structuralism has been regarded as anti humanist in its decentering of human agents from the heart of inquiry. Instead, structuralism favors a form of analysis in which phenomena have meaning only in relation to other phenomena within a systematic structure of which no particular person is a source. So that's the sorry the structuralist understanding of culture is concerned with the systems of relation of an underlying structure, usually what you can say language, and the grammar that makes meaning possible. So, a structuralism, dear friends, can be traced back at least to the 19th century sociologist Durkheim. What I'm doing here is that I'm once again bringing in a sort of some sort of, or what you can say, a little bit of a history of structuralism here. And this is what we have already discussed in detail in the previous lecture again. But I did not mention Durkheim there in that previous lecture. Friends, the fact of the matter is that the 19th century philosopher and sociologist Durkheim has been given the credit of uh, of a thinker who thought in the direction of structuralism, the first thinker who thought in the direction of structuralism, and that was in the 19th century itself. However, we all know that it was basically Ferdinand de Saussure and his works, and through this, that structuralism took its actual shape in the 20th century. And it is Ferdinand de Saussure and then Levi Strauss and then Roland Barthes. They played a very important role in establishing a kind of a relationship, or in establishing a sort of a guidance to cultural studies. In fact, the fact of the matter is that Durkheim did not play a very important role in establishing a relation between structuralism and cultural studies. But there is no denying the fact that structuralism can be traced back at least to the 19th century sociologist Durkheim, who searched for the constraining patterns of culture and social life that lie outside of any given individual. Durkheim, my dear friends, rejected the empiricist idea, the empiricist view that knowledge is to be derived from direct experiences seeking, direct experience seeking, I'm sorry. Knowledge can be derived from direct experience seeking instead of what he called social facts that are socially constructed, culturally valuable, and so generous of particular consciousness. So that is, they exist beyond individuals. Even Durkheim was also thinking in the kind of same direction in which human were basically decentralized out of structuralism. So, for example, the beliefs, the values, and norms of religion, specifically the contrast between, let us say, for example, Catholicism and Protestantism, are said to account for variable patterns of suicide, for example. So, in other words, the most individual act possible, for example, suicide here, is accounted for by normative social structures or belief. However, as I said earlier, it has been the works of Saussure rather than that of Durkheim which has been most influential within cultural studies. So, so Structuralism, my dear friends, in this sense, takes signification or meaning production to be the effect of deep structures of language. Remember, this deep structure is again a very important phrase in linguistics and also a very important phrase in what you can say in the context of meaning, right? So I was saying, friends, that a structuralism in this sense takes signification or meaning production to be the effect of deep structures of language that are manifested in a specific cultural phenomena of human speakers. So here, meaning is not the outcome of the intentions of the actors per se, but out of the language itself. So, a structuralism is concerned with how cultural meaning is generated and understands culture to be analogous to a structured thing like language. So, friends, Saussure argued that meaning is generated through a system of structured differences in language, so that significance is the outcome of the rules and conventions that organize language, which Saussure calls langue, rather than the specific uses and utterances which individuals deploy in everyday life, which Saussure calls parole. So, in short, we can say that Saussure and structuralism in general is concerned more with the structures of language that allow linguistic performance to be possible than with actual performance in its infinite variations. So, a structuralism extends its reach from words to the language of cultural signs in general, so that human relations, material objects, and images are all analyzed through the structures of signs, SIGNS. Now, my dear friends, let us move on to the works of and the contributions of Claude Levi Strauss. Again, I would like to remind you that we talked about the contributions of Claude Levi Strauss in structuralism and its use, its relation with cultural studies in the previous lecture quite in detail. So I'm just referring it here in a small way. In the works of Claude Levi-Strauss, we find the manifestation of a structuralist principles when he describes kinship systems as like a language, so that family relations are held to be structured by internal organizations of binaries. For example, my dear friends, kinship patterns are structured around the incest taboos that divide people into the marriageable relationships and the non-marriageable relationships. But what kind of relatives with whom we can marry and what kind of relatives with whom we cannot marry. So I repeat it once again. Kinship patterns are structured around the incest taboo that divides people into the marriageable and the prohibited. Also typical of Levi Strauss, Strauss's structuralism is his approach to food, that he declares to be not so much good to eat as good to think with. So that is food as a signifier of symbolic meaning, wherein cultural conventions tells us that what constitutes food and what does not, the circumstances of its eating and the meaning attached to it. So friends, Claude Levi-Strauss tends towards the structuralist trope of binaries, the raw and the cooked, the edible and the inedible, nature and culture. So each of which has meaning only in relation to the opposite. So cooking, for example, transforms nature into culture. Look here, the food which is raw is related to nature, and it is cooking, the act of cooking the food changes the food from nature to culture, from raw to the cooked. Further, the edible and the inedible are marked not by questions of nutrition but by cultural meanings. For example, most of you know that the religion Islam prohibits certain foods and call it haram, and allows certain foods calling it halal. So the edible and the inedible are marked by not by the questions of nutrition but by cultural meanings. If you can connect this with the recent reports of the unnatural eating habits of the Chinese and the way this caused the medical emergency in the world. So, an example of this would be the Jewish prohibition, for example. The Jewish prohibition against pork, and you know that in Islam also pork has been made declared haram. It is not edible. The scriptures reprimand the followers of Judaism and the followers of Islam not to eat pork, and the necessity to prepare food in cultural specific ways. So that can also be another example. The way we cook food is basically more because of our culture specific habits. So this binary opposition of the edible inedible marks another binary, the insider and the outsider, the insider of the culture and the outsider of the culture, and hence the boundaries of the culture and the boundaries of the social order has been created. During the late 1960s and the 1970s, another philosopher, another linguistic theorist, Roland Barthes, was devising the ways of structuralism, and was also paving the way for its use in cultural studies. And again, I would like to mention that in our previous lecture titled Linguistics and Cultural Studies, we had already talked about the contribution of Roland Barthes with regard to structuralism, and then its use in cultural studies in quite a great detail. So Roland Barthes, my dear friends, in the late 1960s and in the late 1970s was to extend the structuralist account of culture to the practices of what you can say popular culture and their neutralized meanings of myth. He argued that the meanings of the texts are to be grasped not in terms of the intentions of a specific human beings, but as a set of signifying practices. So, to sum up today's discussion, I would like to present before you three different points, and this is how we are summing up. So, in summing up, we can say that structuralism, number one, understands culture to be an expression of the deep structures of language that lie outside of the intentions of actors and constrain them. Number two, to sum up, number two, structuralism is synchronic in approach so that the structuralist analysis focuses on the structures of relation in a snapshot of a particular moment. And number three is that structuralism asserts the specificity of culture and its irreducibility to any other phenomena. So that's all for today. And I would like to once again repeat to you that the discussion today of about structuralism and its use in cultural studies was in quite brief. We have already discussed this in detail in the lecture titled Linguistics and Cultural Studies. In our next lecture, we will be talking about post-structuralism, deconstruction, and cultural studies. So that's all for today. Thank you very much.